Welcome to the Ethical Schools podcast. I'm Amy Halpern-Laff.
And I'm John Moscow. For this special video episode, we've collaborated with Dr. Meira Levinson of the EdEthics project at the Harvard Graduate School of Education.
This is the second in a series of episodes featuring normative case studies that explore dilemmas in schools. As Dr. Levinson describes in her book, Dilemmas of Educational Ethics, normative case studies are richly described, realistic accounts of complex ethical dilemmas that arise within policy or practice contexts. Each of these case studies focuses on a particular decision point in which the right course of action is unclear. The cases help diverse groups of people discuss challenging ethical questions in nuanced and inclusive ways.
Today, we're exploring the case study Seeing Green, written by Allison Mee Stevens. The case focuses on a young science teacher struggling with how to teach climate change in a community where many people are employed by the natural gas industry. The first part of this video presents the case narrative, performed by a talented group of actors. Immediately following the case narrative, Dr. Levinson will discuss the case with a diverse group of thinkers. In this discussion, they explore the ethical dilemmas in the case, along with the competing values and policy considerations that make the right course of action so difficult to determine.
We hope the case and the conversation highlight many important and challenging questions related to science education, parental rights, teacher autonomy, and community involvement in education. And now, here's the case video.
As a first-year science teacher, Ms. McGuire had entered Maple Rivers High School with excitement. Although she wasn't from the area, Maple Rivers bore strong similarities to her own high school, and she felt a sense of kinship with her students. Ms. McGuire also loved the Maple Rivers community itself. Among the families in the area who weren't in agriculture, many worked as engineers and senior managers in the oil and natural gas industry. They often moved to the area specifically to send their children to Maple Rivers public schools, which were renowned for a close-knit parental community and excellent academics. Ms. McGuire had quickly built a strong rapport with students and administrators alike. Her students in particular appreciated her passion for science and her commitment to incorporating local issues into classroom discussions. Today, however, a sense of tension filled the room.
So remember that last week we brainstormed what we know about the difference between weather and climate, how climate impacts the development of different weather systems, and the Earth's geologic history. And we just watched the video from National Geographic, Causes and Effects of Climate Change, to see how climate change is connected to everyday human activity. Now let's discuss what we know.
This is not real science. The climate change happens all the time, and the people who make this video are just freaking out for no reason.
Shondell.
You all are wrong. Can't you just accept the facts? The video shows all the evidence that humans are causing climate change.
All those numbers came from the EPA. In case you haven't heard, Chandel, the EPA pushes a liberal agenda. We can't make our decisions based on politics.
Mason, you can't call science political just because you don't like it.
Yeah, but you shouldn't be defending the video just because it does agree with your politics. Like Ms. McGuire is always teaching us that scientists question things, look at the data, and challenge assumptions. The only reason you think this video is automatically true is because it backs up what you already believe. You don't know any better than Mason does if their interpretation of the stats is right. So why take it on faith?
It seems like we have a bunch of different viewpoints here. Since we only have a few minutes, why don't you each take out a sheet of paper and write down your position on humans' responsibility for climate change, along with the evidence supporting your claim. Make sure you address information from our brainstorm and the video. You can finish your responses for homework, and we'll use them to continue our discussion tomorrow.
The next day's class went much more smoothly, as students compared their opinion papers with the evidence presented in a UN climate change report that Ms. McGuire helped them find. While there was still some grumbling about politically motivated science, Ms. McGuire felt better about launching the unit, and looked forward to introducing a group project on modifying human behavior to mitigate climate change. Humming to herself, she walked down to lunch duty, where she was surprised to be pulled aside by Mrs. Lee, the school principal.
Can you come into my office after 7th period? I got a phone call this morning. A couple parents want to talk about what happened in class yesterday. Ms. Ruiz and Mr. Fox will be there too. It shouldn't take too long.
Sure. Can I ask what this is about?
What is that group doing over there? Gotta go.
As soon as the school day ended, Miss McGuire made her way to the conference room, her heart hammering double time. Miss Ruiz, Maple River's instructional support specialist, met her eyes with a smile, gesturing to the seat between her and Mr. Fox, Miss McGuire's assigned teacher mentor. Miss McGuire sank down, grateful for their presence. Looking around the table, she saw Mason's dad, Mr. Darrow, and Lindsay's mom, Mrs. Teakin, along with Mrs. Lee.
Thank you all for taking the time out of your Wednesday to be here. As I'm sure you've all heard me say before, at Maple Rivers, we believe in fostering strong academic communities. And as a community, I'm sure we can resolve this.
Resolve what?
Thank you, Principal Lee. Now, I want to be clear about why I'm here. It's important that the classroom be a politically neutral space, and yesterday, it wasn't.
I'm sorry to hear you say that. I agree the classroom should be neutral. But I actually didn't, and well, I guess I still don't, consider global warming to be a political issue. It's just science.
Our children should have the right to use the facts to draw their own conclusions. After all, school is where they learn to think for themselves.
Now, Ms. McGuire, I know you're just trying to teach, and that's fine. In fact, I don't think you were trying to be political either. I just think you don't have the entire story.
What story? Climate science is pretty well established by now.
But science is different from policy. Many academics demonize the petroleum industry in spite of the fact that we all know how much our economy depends on oil, especially right here in Maple Rivers, where energy jobs help us put food on our tables. I mean, I bet half our parents would lose their jobs if we enacted some of the more out there liberal proposals I hear floating around.
True.
So when Lindsay comes home and tells me that she was made to watch a video criticizing petroleum engineering in class, we have two problems. One, I have Lindsay telling me that she doesn't want to be a petroleum engineer anymore because it's hurting the planet, and we need more girls like her in the field. Two, we've needlessly villainized the very industry we depend on. Look, I'm not saying don't talk about climate change. I just want to make sure that our kids don't come home ashamed of what it is their parents do. Teach them about climate science, but then teach them about the importance of energy independence, about the benefits of natural gas, about all the other stuff the media likes to ignore.
First-year teachers often have a difficult time balancing classroom and curriculum. I'm sure we can all trust Ms. McGuire is trying to do right by her students. The question that I'm hearing from both of you is, how can we balance academic and community values at the same time? Mrs. Teakin, I think you offer a very fair middle ground. Let's teach the science, all of it. We can talk about CO2, and we can talk about clean burning natural gas. And we can learn about the importance of the work folks do in the community.
I'll be honest, this compromise worries me. Climate scientists agree that we all need to do our part to keep the worst possible outcomes of global warming at bay, which includes reducing fossil fuel use. If the consensus of the scientific community is considered political, then how am I supposed to teach science?
I get your worry. And you're teaching the curriculum just as we expect you to. But there's a difference between science and activism. You could, and in fact, you should spend some time teaching climate change, but you should also teach students about the community we live in. And hey, I've seen you teach. I know you can do a really great job in connecting school and community.
Yes, I think that is a wonderful way to proceed. This way, the students can discuss current events and science without making anyone feel left out. Let's just incorporate the importance of the petroleum industry into the conversation.
Of course, I think it's important for my students to hear a range of opinions and formulate their own conclusions. But teaching climate change like this feels political. The scientific consensus is that, well, global warming is a major threat to all of us. I just don't want that to get lost in the debate. I don't know that changing the curriculum in this way feels right.
Regardless of how you may feel about the issue, your job is to work in tandem with the community and its values. You're a teacher, and it's your responsibility to let the students debate the issues, not dictate your version of the truth.
Ms. McGuire loves this community, and I have no doubt that she's going to use the ideas from this meeting to grow as a teacher.
All of the participants in the meeting looked to Miss McGuire, clearly expecting that she would concur with the compromise that the others had reached. But she could only focus on the questions running through her head.
What should I do? Would including Maple Rivers' connection to the oil industry minimize legitimate scientific work coming out every day about the dangers of global warming? Or could I somehow teach both and separate science from policy? The fact that so many of my students and their parents doubt the basic veracity of climate science makes it seem particularly important for me to represent the science accurately. But how can I continue teaching climate science the way I planned if I keep running into constant opposition? Do I have some obligation, as Mr. Darrow suggested, to teach in tandem with the community's values, or at least not to undermine its very economic foundation? And if I do teach climate science this year without compromising, will I be able to stay at Maple Rivers in the future? I'm still 2 years away from getting tenure. Am I willing to lose my job over this? What should I say?
All right, I am so excited that we are about to launch into discussing this normative case study, Seeing Green, written by Allison Stevens, who's currently a doctoral student at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. To discuss this case, we have 4 outstanding guests. Shirley Edwards is a longtime friend to this podcast and a member of the board of Ethics in Education Network. Throughout her life and career, which has taken her from Kentucky to New York City to Virginia, she's been a parent coordinator, a teacher, a principal, and an early childhood consultant. She was founding principal of EBS High School for Public Service, which is a public high school in Bushwick, Brooklyn. Our second guest, Tina Grotzer, is a colleague of mine. She's a cognitive and learning scientist at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where her most recent course offering this fall is teaching climate change. And I should say personally that she is a really cherished colleague on the faculty, and I send every single one of my learning and teaching advisees to her classes and try to oversubscribe them every single spring. Randy Curran is another longtime friend. I've known him since I was a graduate student back in the day. He's a philosopher of education and co-chair of the philosophy department at the University of Rochester. He's written numerous publications, really wonderful books and edited books, including his 2017 book, Living Well Now and in the Future, Why Sustainability Matters. And then our fourth guest is Sadie Sunda, who is a sophomore at the University of Idaho, where she's double majoring in civil engineering and in environmental science. She's an active member of the Student Sustainability Club, and she hopes to work in sustainability as an environmental engineer. So welcome, Shirley, Tina, Randy, and Sadie. I am so excited to have you here to talk about this case, Seeing Green, with me. So to get us started, I'm just curious, Tina, do you mind kicking us off to talk to us a little bit about when you read this case, what did you see as being some of the dilemmas in this case, and for whom are they dilemmas?
Sure. As I think about this case, I can see why Miss McGuire, as a beginning teacher, would see this as squarely in her court, something she has to deal with. She's responsible for teaching the science. The next generation science standards in middle school talk about human effects of climate change, and particularly linked to the fossil fuel industry. And so, it feels like it's hers to deal with. In high school, the standards don't focus on human effects so much. They really are focusing on the science. However, when I think about this case, I think that it's actually a dilemma that the entire school has to take a look at. And part of that reasoning comes from the research that shows that unless students understand that they can take action, unless they're empowered to take action and realize that they can make a change in the world, that they really are the ones whose laps this whole problem is falling into. So if the school takes that into account, then it becomes really clear that this is not just about teaching science in a science class. This is about teaching the kinds of actions, the things that we can do, as humans in a human society to make a big difference in the world and to save the planet, quite honestly. And so I think there are a variety of perspectives to bring to bear on the problem, and that this is really a dilemma the school faces in terms of the kinds of conversations that they need to have and the resources they need to bring to bear. More interdisciplinary resources. You can't just send young people out with the weight of the problem without also offering them a path towards solutions. Just really, we see higher rates of depression. We see kids backing down, thinking there's nothing they can do. The mental health issues are just too big.
So I would agree with Tina. I think it's a dilemma for all. Where I think the thing that comes up for me as I look at this dilemma, it's also a dilemma for how you bring parents and community into this conversation when they really listen to their children and oftentimes do not understand standards and how they apply to the school and what it means to science, and also the politics. I felt like that politics was definitely into it, in as much as that most of the parents seem to have been working in one of the places where they have talk about energy. And I think that obviously they wanted their children to be outspoken. They wanted their children to have a point of view, but it didn't seem that they understood exactly what the teacher was doing. The other part is the role of the principal and those persons that support the teacher, which makes the teacher feel like that she is definitely that she has to make that choice, and without the support that she did not get. So I think that one of the things that I look at is that this is, as Tina said, this is for all of them. This is a big conversation, but it's also a conversation about values. How do we help people clarify their values, and how do we take them into consideration when we're having a discussion? So, I mean, that's what I saw. It was a really, really interesting. I felt you want to have the kind of teacher that Miss McGuire is. You really do want to have that teacher who really wants to do the right thing about what she's teaching, but she also gave alternatives. And that's something that I think we have to talk about, is what are the alternatives when we make we have these choices that best move us forward.
I think the largest thing that I noticed was the immense amount of pressure on everyone in the situation. Of course, the teacher not really knowing what to do and having all these people kind of looking towards her, but in reality, it's kind of the entire school. And then a lot of the things that I was seeing was within the classroom, seeing these students fighting with each other, and now they have pressure on them from their parents and not exactly knowing what they're supposed to believe, because I think a lot of it was people putting their position on others. There was the school and the parents talking to the teacher about these things that aren't exactly in her control, but having to make the decisions. I think that having the teacher not exactly knowing what position she's supposed to take, and the parents opposing it in the way that they are, I think that there needs to be a lot of boundaries put between the parents and the faculty at the school.
I think I'd just like to add a couple things. I mean, I think when you're in positions of leadership, you have to figure out what you can do immediately and what you have to step back from and approach in a more deliberative and sustained way. And so where the case ends, I think you've had a sort of rush to endorse a sort of ill-defined compromise. I think the fact that compromise is ill-defined leaves them all with some dilemmas about how to think through what they really need to do. And I think that on the very close-up side of it is you've got students and parents who seem to be in a state of denial. There are different ways to define that, but you've got a town in peril, frankly. It is at present critically dependent on the gas and oil industry. Families dependent on it. That's an undeniable reality that has to be recognized in how to go forward. You've got parents and students who are not ready to fully accept the science. So you've got dilemmas about how to productively educate in that setting. The parents have said, you need to stay away from policy, and you need to give students the evidence and let them judge for themselves. There are things right and wrong in that. So I think one very specific dilemma is, how do you separate the science and the policy? What are the things that you can properly leave to students to try to debate as open questions? Not the science, but things about the future of the town. How do you respond to the community values and perceptions of the parents? You can't give all of their beliefs a free pass. But how to productively deal with the errors in that context is very challenging. So, one sense I have reading it is schools are in a position of educating students and indirectly possibly educating their parents. And the school plays a very critical role in the community. So how does the school play that role in sort of leading the community, leading the students in it first and foremost, but maybe the community more broadly into an acceptable future? There's a lot there that the town has to figure out, not just the students. And figuring out how to teach in that situation is very, very challenging.
I would agree with the fact that this is a larger conversation, Randall. I do, and Tina. What I do concerned about is bringing all these together. How do you have this conversation? You can't always have it at school. I think you have to have it in different types of places, and that's what happened in my experience. We didn't have this just in our school. We had it at the churches. We had it at community centers. We had it on one-on-ones. And of course, what happened is that when people came to when teachers applied for our schools, they knew what to expect. And I think the level of expectations is real important. And I think with Miss McGuire, the thing that concerns me is that she really didn't know what she was being put into when she had the meeting with the parents. So, there was that opposition and the pressure that I think oftentimes teachers feel and why they don't stay in our schools.
So everybody needs to be heard and everybody needs to be understood. And I think that's, a really important starting place. One of the activities that I sometimes do with my own students when they're in a puzzle like this is an activity that comes from work many years ago called moral musical chairs. And what it means is that but in this case, instead of there being one missing chair, everyone has a chair in moral musical chairs. But the first thing I ask my students to think about is, who's missing? Who else should have a seat at the table? Who are the non-obvious players here? Perhaps it's someone on the other side of the world who's impacted by climate change, who's, getting pushed out of their own community. Whereas here we have a community where, people are thriving in the oil and gas industry, and clearly those things are going to change. But they're, I would guess. But so the first question I would really start to ask is about whose perspective needs to be at the table and engaging the students in that. And I think the question also about separating the science from the policy is an important one. There are a lot of ways to address the science here. We teach students to think about claims, evidence, and reasoning, and we ask them to evaluate claims through that way in science. Science is certainly not in the position of shutting down dissent. So, when Mason steps forward and says, this has happened before, well, Mason's actually right. So, longitudinally, if you look at climate change over time, we have had periods in our history where carbon has gone up. It's also been followed by ice ages. So that might be a useful thing for, the class to start to explore, but first sort of honoring that knowledge that people are bringing to the table. And I think one other thing I would say about the science is that, as teachers, as much as we want to be able to invest in students and we hope that we'll be able to change their minds, I would separate that in a couple of ways for Miss McGuire. I think, if she helps her students think about what's sensible, what do I understand? What is the, sort of helping them understand the science? And then there's the question of what's a plausible explanation? How do I start to explain this, and do I accept this as a possible explanation for what's going on with climate change? And then there's the final sort of part, which is about believability. Do you actually believe it? And in my own experiences working with 8th graders, we've spent time sort of parsing out, okay, so that makes sense to me. And I can even see where it would be a possible explanation, they would say, but I don't believe it. And that's their prerogative. But as a science teacher, I would certainly want them to understand the concepts, and I would certainly want them to see them as plausible in terms of being an explanation.
It's interesting what you're doing is actually raising another dilemma in ways for the students of, right, whom should they entrust authority into, and how much should we just place trust in scientific authorities? Tina and I have a colleague, Paul Harris, who does work exactly in this area of thinking about how much trust we actually, that children sort of have to place in adult authorities. And Lindsay, I think, in the case is bringing this up, right, where where Mason is questioning the video that they're watching, saying all those numbers come from the EPA. In case you haven't heard, Chandel, the EPA has been filled with liberals for years. Abby says, Mason, you can't call science political just because you don't like it. And then Lindsay says, yeah, but you shouldn't be defending the video just because it does agree with your politics, right? Basically, they're having a conversation about on whose authority should, can they rest this? And are they, in fact, in a position to judge scientifically? I'm curious, Sadie, you are the closest of any of us to being a science learner. You are currently in a position of learning science. You are the closest to being a high schooler. Can you talk to us a little bit about your experience as a student, both being asked to think scientifically and do science, and at the same time, still being a comparative novice, although clearly way more developed than I am?
It's definitely difficult. I remember growing up in Idaho, there was a point where it wasn't even allowed to teach human-influenced climate change at all. It was completely stripped from our policies, and then it was actually added back at the end of high school. But I come from a community that really does not exactly support climate change at all. And it was very difficult to go through classrooms where there was a lot of opposition and a debate within what we were teaching. I had a couple of teachers that completely disregarded climate change and told us that we shouldn't believe in it. I had a couple that were supportive. And so it was really up to the students to individually decide what they felt, which was not exactly ideal. I think it was really difficult to have that amount of pressure to say that you need to be completely in charge of what you want to learn, and that it's not going to be taught and it's going to be ignored. And then at the end of high school, although we did learn some of the science, it was still, you could definitely tell that it was something that the teachers were really hesitant about. And I wish that it was a little bit more, like there was more of a standard as what we were learning. But I think coming from an area where a lot of the parents, I would not want to be just them to have like a large authority over what we were learning. I think it is more up to the people that have a better understanding of education and climate change to tell what the curriculum should be like in schools.
So I study the cognitive science of how people reason about the complexity in climate change. And, for many of us, it's something that is difficult to understand. When I was a kid in the 1960s, I could look out and see pollution in the sky, and I would believe that we needed to do something. It's really hard to look out and say, oh, carbon, I can't see it. I don't know it's there. It's why understanding the mechanism becomes so important. But at the same time, there are so many complex ideas related to climate change that to truly understand and believe it is a feat that many teachers, haven't accomplished. And so, asking students to is a real challenge. It's an area where we need a lot of really careful thought. I don't know that we're there yet, but we need to get there.
Tina, what you just said makes sense. What I wanted to go back is to Randall, is that when I looked at this case and I heard what the parents' compromise was, I was concerned that parents were seemingly able to make decisions about what the teacher was supposed to do. And it was almost like it was left that way. And there was never an issue about policy. There was never any explanation. So when we talk about the whole process of getting everyone involved, I think that there's ways in which the the leadership has to be able to talk with the parents in ways in which they don't feel that they have the last word. And in this case, I kind of felt like that the compromise that they were giving just didn't make much sense to the process and to to what they were talking about.
What's striking to me in this conversation is that we can go really productively down one of these dilemmas and develop really exciting, valuable, complex thinking about that dilemma, right? So this question about how do we teach science well, particularly climate science, where it requires students to develop kinds of complex thinking, understandings of complex causation, which, as you've pointed out, both Tina and Randy, are hard for adults, including adult scientists with, knowledge in the field, really to grab hold of and understand. And how do we also teach things like the uncertainty of science and the way and sort of the scientific epistemology. And then as Sadie says, there are these dilemmas for the students about learning science. Whom do I trust and why do I trust? And how much authority do I feel I should have as a student versus how much do I want to place it in the hands of others? And what do I do when I see that my own teachers are a little unsure about what they're teaching? Or when I hear something different at home from what I hear from my teachers, from what I hear from my peers, and how do I navigate those spaces? And that's all really, really important in the domain of teaching and learning science. But to go back to so many of the other dilemmas that you guys brought up, that's only one of these dilemmas, right? How do we think about teaching and learning science when the science itself is politically contested? That's a really, really important ethical dilemma. You guys also brought up a bunch of others, right? There's the sticking with the science of it. There was the one that Tina brought up where she said, this isn't about Miss McGuire. This is about the entire school, right? Who is responsible for teaching not just climate science, but really about existential threat and about empowering students then to address existential threat and feel empowered to make existential change, essentially. And how do we think about what it means then to support students gaining agency, and then how we support students mentally for placing that agency on them, right? And we've, I think probably all of us have seen Greta Thunberg expressing profound anger at having this kind of responsibility be placed on her and other teenagers, right? That also feels like a really rich set of ethical dilemmas. How much responsibility should we be placing on students to address the challenges that they haven't created, and who should feel responsible for that in the school? And that's really, really different from another set of dilemmas that you all brought up, which say, Randy, I think, articulated really clearly, is that this just isn't about, who should be responsible for addressing this within the school. This is about an entire community needing to come to terms with who they are and what kind of existential threat they face and what they want to become as a community. How do they decide collectively what it means to survive as a community? To what extent is this about their values? To what extent is this about their current economy? To what extent is this about their current environment and climate and their, how they engage in land use and so forth? How do they collectively think about a way forward, and what would mean still for the whole community surrounding Maple Rivers High School to be a strong collective community in the face of inexorable change? That is really different from the questions that I think Shirley was really leading us down, of thinking about, what are the guardrails that should be set up by whom among different stakeholders? And Tina brought up stakeholders as well. All of you have, right? There were a whole bunch of other things that you guys brought up as well. That wasn't, a summary of everything. But I want to point out that we did a really beautiful job of going down one of these issues, and we have these others that are still out here. Tina, go for it.
So one of the things that I think is so important about this particular dilemma is that it extends so much beyond the community, that it truly is an existential crisis that that humans are facing. Bacteria, other things, they'll be fine, I believe. I don't know, but for humans, this is an existential crisis, and we're all in the same boat. And yet we're not talking with each other. We, it's about finding common ground to have those conversations. But the highest ideals have to do with the continuance of the human species, and every other, beautiful organism on this planet, of, those which we are wiping out at a terrible rate. I know I've been expanding sort of what I want to include in this dilemma, but I think the voices are far beyond us. And I think that they include, even those other organisms that, we are responsible for protecting.
Yeah, so in this case, Tina, I agree with you. I agree with Randall. However, bringing those voices in this particular case is at the very end, when the parents were making their recommendations and the students had already explored how they wanted to be seen and what they thought about the science. I still think this was a great opportunity. So when we talk about bringing them in, and who would have done that, that would have been greatly done by the principal had she had that sense of awareness. So when you talk about the whole idea of bringing community together, there's got to be somewhere where it becomes part of the conversation, to the point that people see it as important to their livelihood. Because definitely in this case, it was about their life. These parents were talking about what they wanted their children to be able to do when they graduated. They might have to get the same job, but they wanted them to know that they had played a tremendous role in taking care of them, and also keeping them safe and healthy. And whatever they were being taught, it was important, because they made it clear that they wanted to keep the science. They weren't willing to agree with it all, but they were willing to keep it. So that conversation of opening it up, which I've seen done, but it can't be done sometimes just totally if the school is isolated from the community.
Right. I mean, I think you've both pointed to the need to create conversational spaces that are sufficiently inclusive. And my experience teaching environmental justice since shortly after Hurricane Katrina, and teaching some of the research on the psychosocial dynamics of denial, is that you have to give people conversational spaces where they can move pretty quickly towards action. It depends on what the setting is. There are little cases that could be a little different from this, where the conversations are very hard, but if you have the different players involved and you have a setting where people can grapple with the troubling emotions and move towards some action, it's absolutely critical. I think the evidence is, once people realize there's a problem and they become troubled by it, right? They become very fearful. They experience guilt and shame and intense anxiety. And if you don't move them towards sustaining conversations, moving towards constructive action, they shut it down. They stop thinking about it. I've lost so many students, in the course of a semester, where they shut down and they wouldn't let it in anymore, versus the ones where I got emails from them at 2:00 in the morning and they said, wow, this is keeping me awake. What do I do? I have a list of things they can do. I will send to them. Right? It's changed over the years, but that's a fundamental dynamic of this, is that you cannot, this goes to the activism versus science. If you're teaching the science and it's troubling, there are lines maybe you can't cross of being an activist yourself on policy, but you have to be prepared to engage students in a way where they can find a way forward, or they will not be able to keep learning and dealing constructively with what you're trying to teach them.
We've named, I think, some pretty fundamental values here that what I'm hearing also can come into conflict. One value is existential survival, particularly of human beings and other, not just charismatic megafauna, but fauna period, and many flora, right? Many of us living on Earth who are Earthlings. A second is democracy. This value of democratic engagement, exercising collective voice, bringing in voices, figuring out whose voices to include and how and why, and so forth. A third value is present day survival, including economic survival, protecting our livelihoods, right? And then this fourth value is actually the present day value of protecting our psyches, and feeling capable of actually taking action and not just shrinking into total shame, guilt, withdrawal, and the shutting down. And these values of mental health and well-being, of economic health and survival, of democratic engagement and respect for multiple voices, and of existential survival, they all seem like valuable values, but they are coming into present day conflict. Randy, go for it. And then I do want to turn to Sadie to hear how she thinks about navigating these. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just want to add, I think another extremely important value is integrity in teaching your subject. And that involves presenting and being a spokesperson for the value of your subject, and honesty in introducing students to it and how it works, but also being mindful of the boundaries of the expertise of those within your subject. And so I think integrity in teaching is absolutely central value here too.
Well, I think the largest dilemma that came to mind for me is the existential crisis. And I think we're largely underestimating what young people can understand, especially in the time we are in today with a 24-hour news cycle and having to do school shooting practices in school and having a lot of other large issues that even as a young child you start to understand a little bit. And I think one of the biggest things that would help make things less political is to just have like a genuine connection to our earth. And I think that that's something that is not exactly represented in our schools. We get this pressure, especially in my generation, that we are the ones that are going to change the world and stop climate change. But at the same time, it's either not taught in schools or it's just a couple of weeks at the end of high school instead of it being a larger thing that is taught in school. I did a little bit of teaching with elementary school students and just talking about the environmental issues in my community. And I think we really underestimate what we can learn even from a young age, and just having that connection and the genuine want and desire to help not only our community, but to help others is something that I don't think is taught enough in schools. So I think having that perspective where you understand the science, but you also do want to change and help what is going on is something that I think needs to be added to the curriculum throughout, not only in high school, but in middle school and down to elementary school as well.
That resonates with what a lot of the research shows in preschool programs, that when kids learn really early to care for the earth, to feel a connection to it, that they continue to grow in those ways. And particularly in the classrooms of teachers who have those kinds of connections, there are really nice examples where people have reached across their differences to think about what's the common principle, the common value that we hold. So there was an example, it was a number of years back now, but Richard Civic, a fundamental conservative minister, I believe, and Eric Chivian, scientist at Harvard, who was head of the Center for Global Climate Education. Well, it was a Center for Health and the Global Environment. They, had very different ideas about what was causing climate change, but what they decided was that they needed to come together because they care about planet Earth. So they created a whole program around creation care. And, I think they got, maybe it was in 2008, Time magazine gave them an award for, one of the most influential, people. But I think as a model, that's inspiring, because even if, Richard didn't agree that it was human causes that the climate change was occurring because of our actions, he agreed that the planet's, this is a beautiful gift that we have here in this precious planet Earth. And so, and then for Eric to be able to say, this is our point of intersection, and be able to run with that and think about what we can do in terms of action, to Randall's point, at that juncture of agreement.
Thank you, Tina. So you've actually moved us directly into where I was hoping we'd go next, which is, thinking about these characters. What should they do in the here and now? Shirley, can you start us off?
What I thought is that Miss McGuire, when she talked about the fact that when they didn't agree, or when they had wanted to explain their positions, she immediately thought about what she could do to make it better or to make it clearer. Her real goal was to be true to what it is she thought she was supposed to be teaching, and she was teaching with the curriculum as she knew it to be the one that she's supposed to. But then again, this is where you have three groups of people who are in disagreement in some ways about something, some part of it, not everything. That could start a conversation had you had the principal understand her role, because she would be the person otherwise that I think would be the person to start it. However, her issue, she was afraid of what the parents would say, so she kind of let the ball drop. But this is not just for the school, but this is something that should be shared with her superintendency, so that she could bring it to a wider audience. because it's just not these parents that are having the issues. There are probably other issues that their parents are having issues with. So who starts this? It starts from where it began. That's where, and you make some compromises, but everybody in this situation could be part of a win. That's what I feel. So the win, yeah.
So can I ask actually really specifically? So Mrs. Lee, the principal, has this fairly young, fairly new teacher
Yes.
who's popular, but is facing this pushback. Are you suggesting that this teacher take this dispute sort of more public and stand up for sort of the science of climate change, or have a public discussion with these skeptical parents even beyond the, her office? That sounds dangerous for Miss McGuire.
Let me just say this to you. I don't get that Miss McGuire is ready to take that on.
Right,
However,
yes, I'm a little worried for her.
But because she really is afraid for her job, and her job is at stake. She's feeling that. But the other part is that she has two people that are supporting her. That was Miss Ruiz and Mr. Fox. And they could be her, she could speak to them in terms of her dilemma. Because her dilemma is, what does she do? Do I just give in? Because and what Randall talked about is that you get a sense of her integrity. That's what I got a sense of, is the fact that she felt that she was doing what she's supposed to do. And she didn't want to compromise on it. There got to be other teachers teaching science in that building. I mean, I don't know no other way that, this is where you begin to lobby somewhere. You use and because this is also political, but it's also economical, because the other part of this is that livelihood is tied to this, and they want their children to believe that they're doing good work and that they're not being damned.
Yeah, you have such a beautiful description of this case. I have to say my own internal anxiety is rising again, because it's taking me back to this dilemma. You're right. I think that Ms. Ruiz thinks that she's a supporter of Ms. McGuire, and yet she's saying, well, there's a difference between science and activism, and I know you can connect school and community, and I'm thinking of as Ms. McGuire, oh my gosh, now what am I supposed to do?
Yeah, but the point is that this is a person who is the curriculum. How does that happen? This happens in our schools, where we have people who are in charge of teaching and teachers, and Miss McGuire obviously came prepared to teach this subject.
Yeah, so Mr. Fox has said, you're gonna keep teaching all the science. That's fine, right? But there's a difference between the science and policy and activism. If she sleeps on it, she doesn't have to change the curriculum to satisfy the terms of this kind of vaguely defined compromise, right? So she should keep teaching the science. I think the issue for her is how she, without changing the curriculum, engages the students. And it seems to me, you might not like this because maybe it's denying it's as hard a dilemma as you're trying to set up to be, but she's very good at engaging the students in taking what they're getting in the curriculum into the community. She needs to frame in a properly conditional way what the scientific consensus is on getting off of fossil fuels. What the scientists can and do say is, well, if we want to avert the worst effects of climate change, we're going to have to get ourselves off of fossil fuels. That's a scientific consensus. Saying what we should do beyond that more specifically, she ought to be putting that to the students. Here our community depends on fossil fuels in these ways, and so on. Here's the setting of our town that we all live in. We all want it to prosper and have a long, healthy future. So put them to work, right, in thinking through what to do with this scientific finding that fossil fuels are a huge driver of anthropogenic climate change.
Another approach for her would be to help the students understand what's necessary to have a habitable planet. So what has to happen on planet Earth? Because planet Earth is remarkably unique and amazing, in the point in which we are living in time, that we have this sort of balanced radiation budget that allows it, you need some greenhouse gases to have it be warm enough for us to be comfortable on the planet and not be, in a block of ice. And then, but you need not too much so that we don't, start to block out incoming radiation. So, to focus on some of the science that makes Earth this unique and precious commodity, if you're going to, I don't like commoditizing planet Earth, but, if you think about, and then you think about also sources of greenhouse gases, it's not just the fossil fuel industry. So methane, cows are the new coal. Issues of the concrete industry. There are lots of different sources. And to start to look at the variety of sources that, it's not just their town, it's not just the focus of their town. And to start to see it in this larger picture, that might also be helpful.
I found in general the whole thing was a little inappropriate to have the teacher there and the principal and the parents, which I know we can all agree on that the way that it was set up was just the principal should have probably stepped in. And I understand that, these are people that rely on fossil fuels, and they also don't want their children demonizing them for their livelihood, and they don't want their kids to hate what they do. But I think it largely just comes back to the classroom, and it seems in this situation that this is some of the kids' first time really understanding climate change, and it's probably just, everything's not going well, and they're probably very, very concerned, and that's why it's coming back to the parents. But I would definitely agree with Randy that the doubling down on the actual science and just adding more levels of communication within the classroom and between the school board and the parents, I think would really start to minimize the issues going on within the case study.
Thanks. I'm really curious, like one of the dilemmas that you all had set up near the beginning was actually that the school is embedded in this larger contextual setting. And this question, I think it was Randy who posed it, of who should the school be educating? And is it that the school should just be educating the students? Is that who they're responsible to? Or in fact, are they responsible to educate the community itself, including the parents? And then also, I think Shirley had posed this really clearly at the very beginning, this dilemma around the policy of the politics, right? Like how should the school be taking a stance on the politics of energy policy, right? And what stance should the school be taking about its role as a mirror of the community, as a vision of a future community?
So one of the things that I thought about is that science is not only taught in her class, science is taught to all the students. So therefore, it becomes a collective problem. So therefore, if you want to, if seeing that this is a dilemma, and Miss McGuire being real smart and forward thinking, this becomes a conversation for the whole school. So this becomes that place where Randy talks about these small conversations. You got to have them, and it takes time because we have to learn how to speak truth to power. That's been my experience with the schools that I've worked with. That you start on the inside and you start bringing the stakeholders into your meetings, and then you go outside. And then you include the school board and the superintendent. And then you also have the data to let them know that sometimes, science sometimes has its relevance. You have to let them know what it is and why it's so important. And then what happens is the community becomes an agent of change and maybe can survive.
Well, so I think that I agree with all of that, Shirley. I think it's so important. It also strikes me, though, that the community needs to be having a conversation in a broader way. And, there's this kind of push and pull between local and, federal sort of guidance in schools. And when communities lose the ability to articulate their vision for the children that they're raising, I think something really important has been lost. But yet in a town here where you have the fossil fuel industry so much, embedded in the happenings, that those sort of federal standards also become important so that it's a conversation between the two. I've also watched towns where people had very little say in what their kids were learning. And you could see that perhaps, the way that things would be prioritized might have been a little bit different for them, given their vision for their children. So this tension, I think, is really important, and it can be generative, and I think it can be a source of growth, but it needs to be a part of democracy and that messy process that, doesn't always get to action by the point we think it should.
Yeah, this all seems right to me. I mean, the community forums and workshops and how to bring in the right people and the right things to engage around. But I just have to add this. I think as I was studying this case study, I'm thinking a lot of these parents have to know that it's a limited horizon, a limited future for their town being able to rely on the fossil fuel industry. They have to know that on some level. They're probably anxious about it, but it's basically an industry in terminal decline. And anybody who's really inside it and knows much understands that it's not going to be, it's going to have a limited role in our future. So, I mean, I think if you can get past the anxieties, maybe you can have some success in engaging people honestly around what they really envision for the future of the community.
In general, I think that a lot of the parents probably don't know and are just as nervous as their kids. I'm sure they know that the impending decline of their economy, and I think it's not only just empowering the students, but also the parents, that they can have a nice, bright future for their community. And I think that starts with the education of the children and the parents, and workshops. I would definitely agree with you guys with having definitely more meetings after the one in the case study and moving forward, not just in the classroom.
Thank you so much to all of you. I will totally agree about the wealth of information that we learned from each of you. And also, I'll just say I really appreciate the way in which you modeled what you were calling for, which was to have a thoughtful collective discussion together with those who are in the room here, but also calling to mind who was not in the room here and whose voices we might have also liked to hear. And so I'll hope that those of you listening to this podcast will also add your own voices and invite others' voices in to converse with you as you think about this case, because I hope that one of your takeaways is that as we think about action as teachers, as principals, as parents, as school board members, as members of communities that are politically divided, but having to make collective choices about how we face our futures together, that you will engage with others whose beliefs and values and ways of being in the world you may not quite understand, that you may disagree with, that you may even be inclined to disparage or reject, but to recognize that if we are going to move forward together, we need to do so together in an inclusive way that includes listening and learning together. And I really appreciate the ways in which all four of you, Sadie, Tina, Shirley, and Randy, have helped model that and helped us do that together. So thank you.
Thanks to Dr. Meira Levinson, Sarah O'Brien, and the EdEthics team at the Harvard Graduate School of Education for working with us to create this special series. Thanks also to today's panelists, Shirley Edwards, Sadie Sundahl, Randall Curran, and Tina Grotzer. And thank you for watching this episode.
You can find separate links to the case video and the discussion video on our website, ethicalschools.org, and on Dr. Levinson's website, justiceinschools.org, where you can also find links to the other cases that Dr. Levinson and her team have created, as well as resources for leading your own discussions about these cases.
We welcome your feedback on this series. Email us and follow us on social media at Ethical Schools. This episode was produced by Hoot Owl Media.